Hello, my friends. For years, we've been told a simple story. Ukraine is a brave democracy, fighting for freedom, and the West must support it at all costs. But what if the truth is far more complicated and far darker than what we see on the news? What if the real experiences of civilians, journalists, and observers on the ground tell a completely different story? In this video, we're going to uncover testimony from someone who spent years inside an international monitoring mission in Ukraine, someone who witnessed disappearances, torture, political repression, silenced journalists, courtrooms controlled by security forces, and civilians living in fear, not of Russia, but of their own government. This isn't speculation. This is not propaganda. These are firsthand observations, buried reports, and suppressed statistics that challenge everything we've been told about this conflict. If you're ready to question the narrative and face some uncomfortable truths, then let's begin. For years, people in the West have been told they must support a proxy war for democracy in Ukraine against Russia, that NATO and the so-called free world are morally obliged to pour money, weapons, and fighter jets into this country to defend freedom, yet long before any Russian operation in 2022. Even before the Maidan events in 2014, official U.S. State Department documents and mainstream Western media openly described Ukraine as one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. Only when the war narrative became useful did the same media and governments suddenly repaint Ukraine as a beacon of democracy and rewrite its history. I speak about this not from an armchair, but from direct experience. For many years, I served on the ground in Ukraine as an international monitor, part of a mission mandated to observe security, human rights, civilian casualties, and the functioning of the legal system in the context of the Donbas conflict, with access to information that the public has never been allowed to see. One of the first and most important truths is that Ukraine, even before 2022, was very far from being any kind of model democracy, and that the Western public has been systematically misled about what truly happened on Maidan in 2014, which is where this entire war really began. The Western narrative claims that a pro-Russian president was overthrown by a democratic uprising and that peaceful protesters were massacred by regime forces, but the detailed 72-page study of Ukrainian-born Professor Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa shows something very different. A large share of the people allegedly shot by police that day were in fact killed from positions controlled by the opposition, the very forces that soon took power, which indicates a false flag operation used to delegitimize the sitting government and justify its violent removal. I encountered this work while in Ukraine, watched the videos he referenced, had local interpreters confirm the subtitles, and saw that the evidence was coherent and compelling. Yet when I tried to draw the attention of a major Western journalist to it, he admitted outright that he would not investigate because it would change too many things. That single sentence revealed that the mainstream media's interest was not truth, but protecting a narrative. And from that point, I understood that since 2014, the Western audience had been deliberately shielded from the reality that what occurred in Kiev was, in substance, a coup d'etat based on the cynical sacrifice of the opposition's own supporters. The mission I worked for was born out of Cold War structures, aimed at creating dialogue between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. After the Soviet collapse, it became a kind of mini United Nations for European crises, first in Bosnia and later in Ukraine. Member states proposed staff through their foreign ministries, so I was seconded by my own defense and foreign affairs structures. But once deployed, I did not represent my home government, I represented the organization. Our mission in Ukraine included Americans, Russians, Europeans, and others. And our official mandate was neutrality. Within that mission, I belonged to a small, specialized unit, often called the Human Dimension, tasked with monitoring human rights violations and civilian casualties, while most of the mission focused on ceasefire violations and heavy weapons withdrawal under the Minsk agreements. We had access to extremely sensitive material names, testimonies, medical evidence, detailed case files, and we operated through two channels: a public or semi-public reporting channel and a separate confidential one for the most sensitive cases, which never reached the public reports and often not even our own colleagues. Roughly 90% of the people working in the mission had no idea what kind of information we were actually collecting. Already in 2015, based on our work on the Ukrainian-controlled part of Donbass, we were confronting recurring patterns of enforced disappearances that looked nothing like the behavior of a democratic state. People would knock on our office doors, these were the so-called walk-ins, and report that relatives had been snatched off the street or pulled out of their homes by masked men wearing balaclavas, thrown into minivans, and driven off at high speed. When we investigated, a consistent picture emerged. These operations were carried out by so-called volunteer battalions that Kyiv had raised after 2014, including units such as Azov, Donbass, Adar, Dnipro 1, Dnipro 2, and others, formations that had weapons, political protection, and a clear ideological profile of radical nationalism. One of my first direct interviews was with a Ukrainian journalist from government-controlled Donbass who was kidnapped in the street by masked men, taken to a basement, kept for 3 days with a hood over his head, stripped, almost naked, tied to a chair, subjected to torture and humiliations he could barely speak of, evidently of a sexual nature, only because he had written about Ukrainian armed forces shelling cities such as Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. He described how they forced him to hold a gun so they could take his fingerprints, then threatened to accuse him of terrorism if he did not comply. Other journalists recounted how SBU, the Ukrainian security service, summoned them and warned them to stop working in journalism entirely or face 8 years in prison on fabricated charges. One editor, whose newspaper carried a pro-Soviet name, disappeared after SBU admittedly held him, then denied knowing his whereabouts. His wife received indirect confirmation from a former detainee that her husband had been seen in custody looking exhausted before vanishing forever. Amnesty International reported his case at the time, but his story has now been buried. All of these things happened on the territory controlled by the government that the West calls pro-European and democratic, not in the separatist area. In parallel, our work attending court hearings in places like Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Bakhmut, and later Mariupol exposed a judicial system that functioned as a pure extension of the security services. There, you could see ordinary people, teachers, small business owners, pensioners dragged before the court under terrorism articles for things as banal as discussing local troop positions with relatives on the other side of the front line. Mentioning on the phone that a school had been turned into a barracks was enough to be charged under articles related to terrorism and collaboration. I obtained statistics from prosecutors' offices in both government-controlled Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and found that once a case went to trial, the conviction rate was effectively 100%. Prosecutors themselves admitted that only 1 or 2 defendants had escaped conviction in a first instance over years, and that they were confident even those would be convicted on appeal. This is not the mark of an independent judiciary. It is the hallmark of a system in which prosecutors and security services dictate outcomes to judges. In Donbass, a colleague of mine turned off his pen and asked a judge, off the record, how the system really functioned. The judge answered quite simply, "The prosecutor asks, and we follow." In one high-profile case in Kramatorsk, I noticed a man filming everyone in the courtroom, including myself. He had no media badge and turned out to be an SBU operative, whose recordings were later used to identify and intimidate attendees at their homes with warnings not to support traitors. Lawyers told us that, in effect, the courts in Donbass were under the control of SBU. And indeed, until 2018, the entire anti-terrorist operation in the East was commanded by SBU, not by the regular army. On paper, Ukraine's constitution guarantees freedom of speech, but its criminal code undermines that in practice. Article 110 criminalizes public calls for changing the country's borders, which means that even a Facebook post supporting the Donetsk or Lugansk People's Republics can land you in prison. In Western democracies, discussions about Quebec independence, Scottish independence, or Corsican autonomy are part of normal political life. Parties advocating such positions sit in parliaments and take part in referendums. In Ukraine, Simply voicing such ideas is enough to be branded a criminal. Simultaneously, the terrorism provisions of the Penal Code were applied broadly to anyone accused of transmitting information, regardless of whether they were actual agents or just people talking to family across the line. In roughly half of the cases I followed closely, defendants complained in open court that they had been tortured by SBU or by volunteer battalions at the moment of arrest or during interrogation, often describing beatings, threats of death, and being forced to sign blank sheets of paper while held in secret basements. A common pattern we documented was arrest off the record, days of ill treatment in an unofficial site, coerced signatures on blank documents, release onto the street, and then a second official arrest some hours later, with previously signed blanks now filled in as written confessions. I heard this scenario from multiple defendants in different towns, and it was recorded by colleagues independently, which strongly suggests a standardized modus operandi rather than coincidence. When I later served in Odessa, another layer of the system became visible through the aftermath of the 2 May 2014 massacre, in which around 40-50 pro-Russian activists were burned alive or beaten to death in and around the trade union's house. Arrests were made on both sides initially, but in practice, only the pro-Russian detainees were held for long periods and brought to trial. Pro-Maidan activists were either never charged or quickly released. One particularly notorious figure, accused of murder during those events, was still walking free in the streets of Odessa in 2022, taking part in anti-Russian demonstrations. Colleagues told me that when his trial had begun years earlier, a group of his associates, former military men, had stormed the courthouse, physically removed him, and declared the court illegitimate to judge a patriot, after which the proceedings simply never resumed. Similarly, in Donbass, we encountered mayors and local officials who described being blackmailed by SBU officers. Pay money or surrender property, or you will be arrested as a separatist and your life destroyed. In one such case, a small-town mayor showed us phone numbers used to extort him. When his contacts in the police ran them, the result came back. They belonged to SBU. This is not the rule of law. It is mafia behavior in uniform. Alongside these institutional abuses, our unit was tasked from 2016 onward with systematically verifying every allegation of civilian casualties on both sides of the line of contact in Donbass. We visited sites of shelling and shooting, spoke with victims and witnesses, examined craters and fragments to determine direction and origin of fire, and built a detailed case-by-case database. At the end of 2016, a special statistical report was prepared, and despite heavy internal resistance, eventually released at least to member state delegations. One of its key findings was that a majority of verified civilian casualties were on territory controlled by the separatists, meaning that most of those civilians had been killed or wounded by Ukrainian fire. The Ukrainian delegation reacted with outrage, and in response, the head of mission decided that henceforth we would no longer publish statistics indicating on which side most victims were located. We continued our field work, but the public would never again see that level of clarity. Unwilling to accept this, I compiled my own analysis once I had access to data from both government-controlled areas and separatist-controlled areas in both Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. When focusing solely on casualties, directly linked to acts of war, shelling, rocket fire, small arms shootings, excluding mines and booby traps in the gray zone, the numbers showed that between 2016 and 2018, roughly 72% of all verified civilian victims were on territory controlled by the separatists. In plain language, this means that Ukraine, the side portrayed in the West as merely defending itself, was in fact responsible for the majority of civilian casualties that we could verify in Donbass over those years. I wrote internal memoranda, arguing that this truth had to be communicated. Otherwise, we were reinforcing a false propaganda narrative in Ukraine and in the West, one that depicted the Donbass population as aggressors and Ukraine as entirely passive. My argument was simple. If Ukrainians realized that people on the other side who often spoke the same language and had family ties with them, were suffering more from their own army's shelling. Perhaps public support for endless war would soften and space would open for genuine peace. My superiors responded with silence. I even went to my own embassy, presented the statistics and their implications, and received polite interest but no action. It became clear that neither the mission's leadership nor my home government had any intention of challenging the official story that Russia is responsible for all 10,000 deaths in Donbass, a line repeated by Kiev's leadership in 2018, despite the data we held. From a moral standpoint, this was a betrayal of the people whose taxes funded our mission, of the principles of neutrality and honesty we claimed to uphold, and of the civilians whose suffering we were supposed to document accurately. In terms of everyday experience, countless testimonies from Donbass residents showed how they perceived the Ukrainian armed forces not as liberators, but as occupiers, roadblocks where locals were harassed, robbed, or beaten, constant intimidation and humiliation. A deep sense that the army in their streets was not their army. If any troops were seen as foreign or hostile by many of these people, it was not Russian soldiers or separatist militias, but Ukrainian forces. These attitudes were never reflected in public reports because they were dismissed as non-factual atmospherics. Yet for anyone living and working there for years, they were central to understanding the conflict. Even apart from the war, Ukraine's political life looked very different from the picture painted in Western capitals. The main opposition forces, especially those advocating the implementation of the Minsk agreements or defending the status of the Russian language, were systematically branded pro-Russian and treated as enemies. In city after city, opposition candidates told me about credit cards suddenly blocked after they announced their candidacy, about banks refusing to intervene, only for banking services to mysteriously resume once they withdrew from the race. In Mariupol, opposition activists who tried to organize petitions and gather signatures in public squares were repeatedly attacked by masked thugs while police stood by. A senior police officer reportedly stated plainly that opposition rallies would not be permitted. Pro-NATO and pro-EU parties, by contrast, could campaign freely. In spite of that, the opposition bloc still garnered significant support in Russian-speaking regions, including Donbass and Odessa, which made it especially intolerable to the authorities in Kiev. Eventually, the Zelensky administration simply banned 11 opposition parties outright, including many representing millions of voters, and placed their leaders under arrest on politicized charges even before the Russian operation of 2022. Add to this the fact that Zelensky's presidential mandate has de facto expired with no new elections in sight due to martial law, and what you see today is not a democracy but a wartime autocracy in which power is concentrated. Dissent is criminalized, and any serious opposition is either exiled or jailed. The corruption that Western officials now grudgingly admit around Zelensky's inner circle, with stolen foreign aid, houses, and bags of cash, is only the tip of an iceberg that reaches down to local prosecutors, judges, and police. I personally listened to mayors and businessmen describe how foreign aid from countries like Japan vanished into the Kyiv bureaucracy before reaching their towns, and how prosecutors, enjoying political protection, used the threat of terrorism charges to extort property. When a small entrepreneur brought his case all the way to a court of appeal in Kyiv, judges closed the file in 15 minutes as soon as they saw the name of a powerful prosecutor implicated in his complaint. Alongside this political and legal corruption, I also encountered disturbing aspects of Ukraine's role as a hub for commercial surrogacy. When a woman working in a clinic explained to me how foreign clients could choose options from a catalog, selecting a surrogate, choosing levels of control over her life, even paying extra to have her effectively locked inside the clinic for 9 months to ensure she does not smoke or drink, turning pregnancy into a literal factory process. She told me that women had to sign contracts promising never to seek information about what would happen to the baby or who would take it. During a flight from Kyiv to Amsterdam, seeing 2 men with a week-old infant and a thick pile of documents breezing through Dutch customs, I understood how easily Ukrainian surrogacy products moved into Western Europe. Prices for these packages as I was told, ran between 5 and 9,000 euros, depending on the option. In a country with weak rule of law, widespread corruption, and an entrenched black market, a system that allows babies to be produced and sold under such conditions inevitably raises the specter of exploitation, human trafficking, and worse, even if concrete proof of the darkest crimes is hard to obtain, as it naturally would be given the taboo and secrecy around organ harvesting or child abuse networks. Taken together, the human rights abuses, the shelling of civilian neighborhoods, the judicial farce, the suppression of opposition, and the commodification of human life form a picture of a state that has very little in common with the idealized democracy Western leaders claim to be defending. Yet those same leaders are now aggressively shaping a narrative in which Russia is depicted as a revived Hitlerian threat intent on conquering all of Europe, and Ukraine is a noble victim whose cause justifies pushing NATO and the EU step by step toward a direct confrontation with Moscow. Senior officials, generals, and media figures in France, Germany, the UK, and the Nordic countries increasingly speak as though war with Russia within a few years is inevitable, telling their populations to prepare mentally for such a conflict. This is not spontaneous, it is coordinated messaging designed to manufacture consent for escalation. In Europe, unlike in the United States, there is no strong constitutional framework to protect citizens from supranational institutions. The European Commission is not directly elected and keeps extending its competencies beyond what treaties originally allowed. Under the guise of combating disinformation and extremism, Brussels pushes laws like the Digital Services Act and proposals such as chat control that would in effect legalize mass surveillance and censorship of private communications, including encrypted messages on platforms like WhatsApp or X. At the same time, people in the UK, Germany, France, and elsewhere are being called in, interrogated, or even arrested for social media posts that challenge official narratives about Ukraine, NATO, or Russia. The space for free speech in Europe is shrinking rapidly, and the specter of war serves as a powerful pretext to accelerate this process in the name of security. In this climate, Ukraine functions as a moral alibi. A corrupt, repressive, Western-dependent regime is presented as the front line of our democracies, so any questioning of support to Kyiv is branded as treason or Kremlin propaganda, while in reality we are being dragged toward a potentially catastrophic confrontation with a nuclear power based on lies and omissions. From my vantage point, as someone who spent years on the ground, who saw files others never saw, who spoke with victims and officials from all sides, it is clear that the story told to Western publics about Ukraine and Russia is fundamentally distorted. If people in Europe and North America truly understood how Ukraine has treated its own citizens in Donbass since 2014, how its courts function, how its security services operate, and how its political system silences dissent, many would think very differently about sending ever more weapons and money there. We are living through a dangerous time in which manufactured narratives are pushing us toward a war that could devastate the continent, while those who speak out are marginalized or ignored. For my part, I have chosen to tell what I saw, knowing that it likely closes the door on any future in government service, because the cost of silence watching Europe sleepwalk into disaster on the basis of falsehoods is, in my view, far greater than the personal consequences I may face.